So, there was recently a Steam sale, and of course, as a huge PC gamer, I bought as many games as I possibly could afford. I ended up with a solid total of 23 new games, so like $10. I was gonna buy a 24th, but I ran out of money. Only problem, well, besides my empty bank account, is that I am currently an idiot and I have a Mac. I can't play any of these. So, my solution? Download the ROM for a Half-Life port for the Dreamcast that never came out. Now sure, you can play the full single-player campaign for Half-Life with this, but there's a whole other half of the game that's missing, and whether it even existed at all is questionable. So I took a look into the history of this bizarre port to try and get to the bottom of this mystery. In case you're unaware, the original Half-Life was developed by Valve and published by Sierra Online on PC in 1998. It had a single-player campaign and a multiplayer deathmatch mode. It ran on what is now known as the Gold Source engine, which itself was basically a heavily modified version of the Quake engine. Valve, however, had a lot of faith in this engine, so they really encouraged modding and pushed community-made content while also having some official expansions and ports made. So, Valve brought in the team behind a popular multiplayer Quake mod called Team Fortress, and had them actually make a new Team Fortress mod for Half-Life. Valve liked it so much that they actually started selling it as a standalone game in April of 1999 as Team Fortress Classic. Later on in 1999, Half-Life Opposing Force was released. This is a standalone expansion to the first game where you could play as one of the enemy soldiers that you fought, which I've always thought was a really cool concept. This time it was developed by Valve and Gearbox Software and was once again published by Sierra Online. Gearbox was basically brought in because Sierra and Valve wanted to keep making money off Half-Life, but Valve was busy with bigger projects like Half-Life 2 and Team Fortress 2. Opposing Force is a solid expansion though, so Gearbox continued to work on the Half-Life series. Sierra then attached Gearbox to a new project, a port of Half-Life for Sega's recently launched Dreamcast, which would have been the first console port of Half-Life. The Dreamcast released in late 1999 and the Half-Life port started development in early 2000. The port, however, would be developed by Captivation Digital Laboratories, and Gearbox would be put in charge of a new Dreamcast exclusive expansion. In this expansion, you would play as the security guard Barney Calhoun from the first game. The Dreamcast allowed for new, better-looking graphics with double the polygons as the original PC game. That, along with the new expansion and the online multiplayer, which was new to consoles at the time, would have made this a pretty impressive port. It was supposed to come out in the summer of 2000, but got delayed to September. Pretty much no information was available during the entire summer, except that the expansion was called Blue Shift. Then, in September of 2000, the game was finally supposed to be releasing soon. Then they announced that the game would no longer be coming out in September, and had been delayed to November. But it wouldn't have any multiplayer at all, even though this one old trailer for it clearly shows the multiplayer mode. This trailer also seemed to have this weird thing where Gordon goes into Doom mode for some reason and holds his gun directly in front of him. I don't know what's going on here, but the quality of this trailer is questionable. It seems to show the original PC game in most of it, as a bunch of these models are definitely not the HD ones from the Dreamcast port.
It's thinking.
Then November came. Sierra started shipping out early copies to various game publications and the reviews started coming in. And they were mixed at best. Reviewers from the time complained about the poor frame rate, brutal loading times, but mainly the missing multiplayer. Shockingly though, Sierra actually seemed to listen here. Instead of just putting out an unfinished game anyway, they delayed it again, for better or for worse. This time they said that they would improve the game and release it before the end of the year, but the multiplayer still wouldn't happen. Yet. Sierra said that at some point later a second Half-Life disc would be released with the other half of the game, the multiplayer. This disc, however, seemed like it would have been packed. It would have had the Opposing Force campaign expansion with its multiplayer, the original Half-Life Deathmatch multiplayer, and Team Fortress Classic. Then the end of the year came and went, and there was silence. The next few months would go by with almost no mention of the game, until March 29th, 2001. Sierra announced that Blue Shift would be coming to the PC as a standalone expansion, and that the Dreamcast port would be delayed again. It was pretty clear at this point that Sierra was losing faith in the port. I think fans were definitely losing faith at this point too. Whatever faith that anybody had left was crushed even further just 2 days later when the Dreamcast was discontinued by Sega after it just couldn't compete with the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. But still, not all hope was lost yet, because at E3 2001, Sierra announced that the port was pretty much complete and that it would still be officially released in July. But Blue Shift and the HD graphics pack would be coming to the PC before the Dreamcast port on June 12th. And then, as they said, on June 12th, 2001, Blue Shift officially launched on PC with the graphics pack. And just 4 days later, the Dreamcast port got totally cancelled. And unfortunately, Captivation Digital Laboratories went down with the game. This would have literally been their first game, but despite all the time and work they put into it, Sierra just didn't see any point in releasing it now. That wasn't the total end for the port though. As I mentioned, its graphics and the Blue Shift expansion both made their way to the PC, and the scrapped port basically laid the foundation for Gearbox's PS2 port of the game, which actually did come out. Oh, and also now the ROM is online, which is of course how I got to play it. It leaked a few years after it got cancelled, and since the Dreamcast just takes raw CDs without any kind of protection, you can just burn this thing onto a disc and play it on your Dreamcast. Copies of the game are cheap too, since they're all homebrews, and it seems to be one of the most, if not the most, burned game on the Dreamcast. I don't have a Dreamcast though, so I'm stuck using a dreaded emulator.
Stop right there, criminal scum! Nobody breaks the law on my watch!
Luckily this is Sega though, because if this was a GameCube, Nintendo would have already crucified me. Honestly though, it's a pretty cool port. Sure, the frame rate is god-awful, the load times are ridiculously long, and there are some bugs here or there, but for the most part, it feels as polished as it could possibly be. All of the main campaign and Blue Shift are here, as far as I could tell, and it even has the little Hazard Course training tutorial. For such an ambitious console shooter before Halo, this feels pretty impressive. And if you're on the Dreamcast, you can even plug in the Sega keyboard and mouse to play this game without what I assume would be the jankiest controls ever. Like seriously, how are you supposed to play such a fast-paced first-person shooter with this controller? I really don't know. I feel like there are a ton of versions of this thing online, but I played what I think was the last official build of the game. If you're interested in trying it for yourself, I would look into the different versions more, as some fans have modded it to reduce load times and increase the frame rate and stuff like that. I just wanted to try out the base game for this video. Besides fan-made fixes for the game, there are even full mods for this thing. I haven't played any of these, but some of them look really cool, like Half-Life Grunt. Basically a new expansion made specifically for the Dreamcast, which seems to run even better than the regular game. And They Hunger, which is a total conversion survival horror game. There's even a version of the original Counter-Strike on here, but it doesn't have actual multiplayer, unfortunately. But as for the official multiplayer disc, well, I would guess that it never even started development. With how many times the base game got delayed, I really doubt it was ever started. Maybe there's some tiny sliver of a chance that some super early prototype build was created, but I think even that seems pretty unlikely. But there was actually mention of the multiplayer in the official Prima strategy guide, which actually came out before the game did, so stores are literally giving them away when the game got cancelled. Also, there was a Deathmatch Map in the game's files for some reason. It was obviously not used in the game, but just the fact that it's here at all makes me think that maybe there was some attempt at creating a multiplayer mode on the first disc at some point. Honestly, it could have even just been like the PS2 head-to-head deathmatch, which was literally just a two-player split-screen match. And this one map did end up appearing in the PS2 version of the game, so I think that could have been possible, and if any form of multiplayer existed at some point, that was probably it. I did find some older forum posts where people were talking about what appeared to be some kind of scrapped multiplayer components in the port, and how they wanted to try and turn them into something working, but I couldn't find any updates on this. So there is some potential that some really early build of the game could exist with some multiplayer testing, but it's definitely never surfaced. The general consensus from these forums seemed to be that there was no way to connect to the internet, but there was some kind of way that you could host a server and potentially play some kind of multiplayer match. But again, this was very early scrapped material, and I really couldn't get anything from it myself. But to me, it definitely does look like there's some kind of multiplayer settings here, so it's definitely possible that this was planned for the game at some point. There was, however, an early version of a port of Opposing Force made by fans for the Dreamcast. So eventually it is possible that the full second disc could be put together and released by fans someday, but it still seems pretty unlikely right now. But really though, fan communities seem to be able to figure anything out, So I really hope that someday they can find the rest of this multiplayer, put it together, put opposing force on there, and someday we can see this game brought to its full potential. Just 20-something years too late.